If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I think it'll be useful to talk about learning how to learn. I'll explain why I think that's important. But if you're not currently doing some skills-based learning, you'll want to hear this. We'll talk about motivation to learn, and we'll talk about the shortcuts for whatever skill you're trying to pick up. Let's learn to learn. Certainly, if we're going to be more productive, we have to learn new skills, and we have to get better at the skills we have. Knowledge is important, but as adults, we get paid for producing results. And the production of results is what requires skills. I'll say a lot more about skills versus knowledge in a minute. I run into people who seem to have limited desire to learn. Well, I'd learn X, but I don't have time. I'd go take lessons, but I don't have money. All these reasons to not engage with learning. Now, that balance is certainly your own to decide, but I don't want us to be scared away from learning. So I want to break it down and think through some aspects of skills-based learning that will help us. In my experience, when adults decide to learn something, they're usually more comfortable trying to learn new knowledge than trying to learn a new skill. So I spent some time thinking about why that is, gathering some evidence, and trying to figure out what to do about it. In fact, I went and picked up a skill. Talk about what that is. You've probably heard this story before if you've listened to the podcast. While I was picking up this skill, I learned some lessons about learning, and I'm going to share them here. You may be saying, "What do you mean, Larry? I know how to learn. I went to college. I'm a good learner." And I'd say, maybe not. I think many of us learned how to pass tests and write papers, but that's just part of it. I'll give you evidence from my interaction with students and university settings that maybe we have not been taught how to learn. And again, I think learning is very different as an adult than as a college student. I think our motivations are different. I think we have greater resources that we can throw at the problem of learning. I think we're better in control of our time in many ways. I think that most people in college and younger feel that it's just something that's expected of them and that they'll learn until a certain point in time and then they'll stop learning and then they'll go do things. As adults, when we're learning, we typically don't feel that way. We feel a different motivation. We have reasons for wanting to learn something, and then we can go learn it. As a caveat here, I'll say a lot of the examples that I'm going to talk about involving learning skills, these examples took place after my kids had gone to high school. And that does make a difference in terms of available time and available resources to apply to the learning problem. Now, I think learning is important. Regardless of where you are, you need to be learning. If you want to advance in your career, you need to be learning. Marshall Goldsmith wrote a book some years ago titled, "What Got You Here Won't Get You There." By this, he means that the things that made you successful in your current position won't be the ones that make you successful in your next position. For example, when you get promoted from individual producer to team lead or manager, the skill set changes dramatically. In Goldsmith's opinion, this is why we have the Peter principle. But it's important for your career to gather new skills and to be good at gathering skills. It's important in terms of productivity. gathering new skills as you gain skill. In your career, you should be spending less time on the things that you're skilled in. These things should take you less time, less effort, less mental resources if you're good at them. That's what we mean by learning and experience, and that'll save you time and make you more productive. In our lives as humans, we need things to grow and get good at. In the business world, just about everything's a live fire exercise. But we need things that we can learn and practice, things that don't cost us money if we fail, things that have less risk. Then in these areas, we can be more exploratory. We can avoid jumping straight to the result that's needed and avoid taking the shortcuts rather than actually learning how to do something. I want to note again that all the things we just talked about are more about skills than they are about knowledge. And we'll talk about skills versus knowledge as we go through the podcast. Learning to learn. I think we struggle with implementing the idea of learning. I think many of us would assent to the statement, you need to be learning. Yes, I need to be learning. But then we struggle to actually do it. I've struggled. I'm thinking back on my own struggles about what I was thinking at the time. What was I thinking that moved me away from taking advantage of learning new skills? One is, hey, maybe I'm not so smart. Maybe I can't learn this. I don't want to be disappointed. I certainly don't want to look foolish at the same time that I'm being disappointed. Look, I went through school and I got good grades. I've got diplomas and maybe honors and awards for my efforts. Why would I take on something that's going to make me look bad and disappoint me? And that hinges on whether or not we have confidence that you can learn, or maybe not confidence that you can learn. So the point of this podcast is to put things in your hands that will allow you to have more confidence about your learning, particularly as it relates to skills versus knowledge. And again, I think those are different things. What many of us learn in college is knowledge-based. It's read a book, tell me what was in the book. And I have some experiences that are a little bit different than that as a teacher. And I think that gives a different perspective on learning and how it's done. I believe that many of the expectations on a college student are to learn knowledge, and learning skills is less common in many of the university disciplines. There's a lot to say here, and I'll say it as we go along. But as a university professor, looking at my students and looking back at my own academic career has given me some insights. And maybe those insights aren't terribly common. So I'm going to share those with you here. And many of these are about learning new knowledge, learning knowledge material. And some of them are about skills, but not most. And we'll talk about that distinction. First, I'll say I have yet to find a situation where there is significant teaching to students about how to be a student. And I think that's unfortunate because we educators say we want people to A, succeed in school, and B, to become lifelong learners. That is, to be excited about the prospect of learning and to be skillful at learning. Unfortunately, there's no time when we teach people how to learn. In fact, it's more of an expectation that people will learn than it is a specific effort to help them learn to learn. So recently, I was giving a productivity talk to college students, and I'm talking about productivity, but when I do this, invariably, the topic turns away from core productivity practices. And the talk with students turns into practical tactics for being a better student. Quite often, they'll ask questions like, what note-taking system do you recommend? How should I study? My answer to that is I'm not sure I know, but I'm trying to figure it out. Unfortunately, as far as I see from my own experience as a student, from my now young adult children's experiences, from other students I've run into, from 5 years, 10 semesters of being a university professor, we just don't teach good learning skills. I don't think I'm great at these things despite the PhD. And I'll talk about my study into becoming a better student as we go along. I've been promising to talk about learning a textbook versus learning a skill. And I'll make a distinction between these two things so we know what we're talking about. I don't mean that one is more important than the other. I think that one is often more heavily emphasized in college. It's not universally true. Doctors, dentists, accountants, the professions learn the practical skills of using a tool set. They're more skills-based learning. But I think in many instances, we default to knowledge-based learning rather than skill-based learning. For me, a skill is something that produces results in the world using a specific set of tools. Learning a skill, therefore, is learning how to use the tools. Now, there's no bright line. Any skill requires some knowledge, and there are few applications of knowledge that are entirely mental in scope. You have to do something in the world. Now, I taught programming, and that gave me a different kind of an insight because programming is very much a skill. Students pass the class by writing programs that produce the desired results in the world. And this is not a manual skill like playing a guitar, but it is still a skill-based thing. You can read all the books you want on programming. You can know computing theory, you can know algorithm theory, you can know syntax, whatever. But until you actually sit down at a keyboard and write out some lines of code that work, you're not going to pass that programming class. And that was a different perspective for the students. For example, some students would test very, very well on paper and not be able to write code, and others were the other way around. I think there were some students who said, I'm going to read the text and take the tests. And there are other students that said, you know what? I'm going to start building stuff. Others, I don't know what to build, so I'm not even going to start. Another interesting thing about learning skills versus learning knowledge is that as children, we learn lots of skills. A lot of them are physical skills when we're babies, but that's not really what I'm talking about. We learn lots of skills as children, and we do it naturally. We learn how to ride a bike, we learn how to ride skateboards, we learn how to do sports, play basketball, play baseball. We learn how to cook or work in the yard gardening. All of these things, we learn all these things as children. And then it seems as we get further into our academic careers, we turn our minds more exclusively towards this acquiring knowledge kind of learning. I'll say, in my experience in the adult world, we're expected not just to know things. Unless you make your living as a Jeopardy contestant, you're expected to produce results in them. And when we produce practical results in the world, we're applying skill-based learning. Interestingly enough, I think this is a factor in reluctance to learn as adults. So I'll use my background and I'll share some different experiences in these areas regarding learning as an adult. I'll highlight 4 of my experiences here for illustration, and that'll give some context for what I'm talking about. As an adult, I've had 2 school experiences. The first was getting an MBA, and that was about 20 years ago now. The other was getting a Ph.D., and I finished that about 10 years ago now. The other 2 experiences that I'll bring in are not school experiences. I learned to play the electric bass, and you may know that if you've listened to the podcast. The other one is learning to do this podcast. Yes, it's a little meta. I'm talking about learning to learn while on a podcast that I'm learning to learn how to do. So that'll be fun. But these 4 different things that I've done as an adult that are examples of learning. 2 are maybe more academic, we'll talk about that, and 2 are much more skills based. What are the differences between these 4? One difference, and this may be a surprise to you, the MBA was the most purely knowledge based. You may have thought it was the PhD, but it really wasn't. The PhD had a lot to do with learning skills, learning how to write academic papers, learning how to write a dissertation. And these are things that produce tangible results in the world. So in my mind, the PhD was much heavier on skills than the MBA was. The MBA was very knowledge-based. It involved lots of testing and a few papers. There wasn't much show me you know how to do something. So it's fascinating and maybe a little counterintuitive to what you might have expected. Of course, learning the bass was very much of a skill. There's a little bit of informational content, but there's a whole lot of touching the thing. And if you're not making the right sound, it doesn't matter what you're thinking. It's still the wrong sound. And then podcasting, as it turns out, there's components to podcasting. So podcasting and the bass, they're both skills based. But the bass, I'll say, I'm not as actively learning the bass as I once was. For reasons that I won't get into, I'm in maintenance mode on bass right now. But I'm very much in learning mode on this podcast. I learned things while I was learning the bass that I'm applying in learning how to do the podcast. I think that'll be an interesting contrast for you. Now, of these 4 things, I approached each one really quite differently. I didn't do any prep for the MBA. I prepped for the GMAT, and that's the test that gets you into graduate school, as you probably know. I prepped for that. But I did things in the MBA pretty much the same way I did them in college and even in high school. In the PhD, I thought and tried to study a good bit about how to learn. I really thought about how to learn. But I wasn't able to find the resources. I wasn't able to find any teaching on this. And that was a huge disappointment to me. But that really was the first kind of idea of, if by the time you get into a PhD program, nobody is teaching you how to learn, then apparently they just don't teach that. And that got me wondering why. Now, years later, I found some books on the subject of school learning by Cal Newport. And I've just had a quick look, but they seem to be very good resources if you're looking for something in that vein of how do I take notes? How do I study? What do I do with lectures? I recommend Cal Newport's books on that. Now, on the other hand, with the bass and on the podcast, I hired coaches both times. And that was a new experience for me. As a younger person, I played golf for 15 or 18 years. I got pretty good. I shot in the low 80s. If you know anything about golf, that's not bad. But I never, ever hired a coach. And thinking back on it, I'm now saying, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. That was probably a mistake. I probably could have gotten a lot better with a coach who could help me. So in these 4 different areas, I've done different things. And so comparing and contrasting a little bit. For a minute, let's talk about the goal of learning. The goal of learning is to change the way our brain operates. That's true whether it's storing knowledge or whether it's storing skills. Either way, we want to change the way our brains operate. And I'll talk about brains for a minute. You may know some of this, but I'll run over it pretty quickly. Our brains work around chains of neuron firing. A neuron fires and it helps other neurons to fire, and that spreads out throughout your brain. It's very involved, but we understand it fairly well. These chains fire, and that's how our brain works. That's how we have thoughts. That's how we remember things. In addition to the neuron thing, we've learned about brain plasticity. And there was a time 100+ years ago when most people thought that our brains were fixed. In fact, most people thought that our brains were very mechanical. We've since disproven that. So with brain plasticity, we change the way our brains operate, particularly at this neuron level. We don't change the fact that we have neurons and synapses, but it's very plastic, very moldable. And if we're defining learning, changing the way our brain operates is about as close as I can get to a definition of learning. Knowledge learning is about having a new or a different thought. Skill learning is about having a different physical process. It seems very different, but both of those are chains of neurons that fire, that either produce a thought or produce a motion or an action for us. Now, it's very interesting that while our brains are plastic, they're also habitual. And what I mean by that, our thoughts become habitual and our actions become habitual patterns in the sense that these chains that fire often become easier to fire. And I'll give an example. It's typically the idea of ruts in a dirt road. The first time a vehicle goes down that dirt road, there's not any ruts and it doesn't have a clear path for where it's going. After it's traveled multiple times, these ruts appear, and then it's pretty easy to follow them. It's easy for the vehicle to stay in the ruts. It's easy to get in the ruts and it's easy to stay in there. And that's sort of the way these chains of neurons work. And the phrase is neurons that fire together wire together. That means if we've triggered a chain a bunch of times, then it's easier for that chain to trigger. I think that's learning. So in both kinds of learning, both skills-based learning and knowledge-based learning, we're creating new patterns or chains of neurons. Ideally, if we're learning right, this is why repetition is important. If we can have the correct chain fire multiple times, then we create these metaphorical grooves, and that's where our brain naturally begins to think. So we talked about knowledge versus physical. When I'm doing a physical thing, a skills-based thing, I want that physical motion to fire in an easy chain. As an example, if I'm playing the bass, I desire to not have to worry about where my fingers are on the fretboard. The goal is my fingers move more automatically on the fretboard. Maybe the goal is for me to think of a sound in my head and then have the bass make that sound without all this messiness of deciding which finger on which string and which fret, because that slows me down. That's my goal. I want that chain to fire. I imagine the sound and physically I make the sound come out of the instrument and I don't have to mess around with the details in between. Again, that's repetition so that that chain sets and then becomes easier to do. I imagine a sound or hear a sound and my hands move without having to think about it. I think this rut idea also applies to memorization in the knowledge world. In knowledge-based learning, I might be trying to get a chain to fire that says, for example, E equals MC squared, and associated knowledge then comes to mind. And what that means is I'm trying to get my brain to recreate a thought that somebody else had and to recreate it easily. And we call this memorization. As an example, most people memorize the multiplication table. 6 times 6 is 36. We don't do the math and we don't think about it hard. That's a chain of neurons that's fired to produce that thought or that result. And that memorization works in different ways in different scenarios. But learning then is practicing and repracticing a chain of neurons firing, whether those neurons result in a knowledge-based statement of fact or whether they result in my ability to use my finger to make an E on the base. Either way, it's still this neuronal change. It's this change in the pattern of neuron firing. And that's how we change the way our brain operates. We know pretty well how to do this. Most of the time, it's just repetition. When we look at both kinds of learning, I'll say, I think we have some fear around learning. And in my own experiences, I've been trying to think of what motivated me to take on the task of learning. What motivated me to stick with it long enough to achieve some results? I'm not the greatest bass player in the world, but I do play well enough that they let me get on stage and seem to want to have me back. They keep inviting me to come play. As an aside, if you'd like to hear our band, let me know. I'll send you links to our recorded church services, and you'll probably recognize one of the bassists. I think the fear we have around learning, though, I think that fear may be what's stopping us from engaging in learning. And the fear may sound like, well, I'll never be any good at this, so I'm wasting time and effort trying to learn it. It may sound like my first performance might not be good enough. It might be stupid. People think I'm stupid. We face lots of challenges here. Our expectations are really, really high when we're trying to learn something. Also, our ego gets involved. And learning is frustrating to us because as adults, we're not used to not getting the results that we want in them. I say that because if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a reasonably successful business person, probably in the United States. You've moved up in your career. You're probably somewhere in management and you're probably making a pretty good living. And then we look at learning something and we're starting over, just like rank beginners. And our brain says, well, I don't want to go through all that again. I really don't want to be bad at it long enough to get good at it. And then there's efficiency questions about how quickly can I learn this, and all that's in there as well. But as it relates to knowledge learning versus skill learning, I think we're more likely to go learn some new knowledge than we are to go and learn a new skill. It's really interesting, though, because it's the same brain process. The difference between learning new knowledge and learning a new skill is that the skill produces a result in the world. Knowledge, not usually so much. As an example, if I read a textbook, nobody's going to give me a test. As an adult, I read a textbook. Nobody's going to sit me down with a piece of paper and say, okay, tell me everything you learned. What's going to happen is I'm going to say I read the textbook, and y'all are going to assume that I pretty well captured the knowledge. I say, well, I read this book. They say this. Here's my opinion. And y'all say, okay, he learned. Because we're not tested on the knowledge that we acquire as adults, it's really hard to see how well we did the task of acquiring that knowledge. On the other hand, If you come see me play bass, you might say, well, he's not all that great. He hasn't learned. Fair enough. If I'm not making pretty noises, then I'm not a good bass player. And that's really one of the fascinating subplots here about learning. And that is, if we're learning a skill that produces a result, it's really easy to see that we're not very good at it. Versus if we read a book and acquire knowledge, it's hard to see that maybe we didn't acquire the knowledge very well. So I think when we look at acquiring skills, that fear is a little bit different. And I think it's very much present for us. So I think we overemphasize learning new knowledge versus learning new skills, when in fact, learning new skills would be most valuable to us for all the reasons that we talked about in the opening, for career reasons, for happiness reasons, for lifestyle reasons. So we'll look at these examples and we'll draw some conclusions from them. I'm in the middle of this intense learning about how to do the podcast. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But first, about the bass, I just picked it up. I didn't have any real background in stringed instruments. I played the piano some as a kid, and I've always been a singer to some degree. But I never knew how to play the guitar, the ukulele, or anything like that. I just picked up the bass and went at it. Now, with the bass, I had good motivation because I wanted to play with my church band. I wanted to be on stage. And that's an actual goal. And that's good. But I didn't have any money on the line. It was never really a live fire exercise, the learning part. It was, hey, Larry, go practice. And when you feel like you're ready, you give us a call and you can hang with us on Wednesday. If everything's okay, we'll play some stuff on Sunday morning. No big deal. So there wasn't deadline pressure. There wasn't financial pressure. It wasn't a live fire exercise for me to learn. It took me about a year and a half before I felt like I was ready. That's plenty of time. And again, in the business world, when we're having to pick up a skill, mostly it's under live fire. Somebody says, hey, go figure out how to, fix the wheel on the car. And you got half a day. We got to have the car working. Go fix it. And that's tough. But with the bass, I didn't have that problem. So I was able to inspect the learning process. Looking back on it, I feel like I did some things with learning the bass that made it easier. And so I'm trying to apply those things that I learned about learning to the more intensive learning that I'm doing right now on how to be a better podcaster. And I'm trying to take away those lessons. Of course, doing the podcast is a practical exercise. It produces a result in the world that is judged. It's visible and it's judged. And it's very practical. For one thing, it has to do with speaking in certain ways. I'm trying to learn to avoid filler words. And that takes a different physical skill. Because I don't intend to put filler words in, I don't do it because I think they sound good. I put filler words in just because that's the way my brain fires. So I'm trying to learn a new way to make my brain fire. In the podcast, there's lots of different skills to learn. For example, I edit my own audio. I'm not editing video yet. So I've got to learn to use the audio editing tool and produce a result. And it's very clear, at least to me, when I've done a poor job of editing audio. But I've got to be willing to go through that learning. And I've got to be somewhat patient with myself. As I said, I'm applying lessons learned in my learning about the bass to the podcast. And I was thinking, well, if I can develop those ideas into some template about learning a new skill, then I can apply that to the podcast. It was not a template that I had when I started learning the bass, but applying it to the podcast helps me refine it And now I'm trying to share it with you. So we want to think about this template for learning, these not tips and tricks, but these ideas about the process of learning that make it easier to do, more highly motivating, these kinds of ideas. I will say we need a skill to try to learn as we think it through here in the podcast. And I think in this podcast, we'll consider using the attention compass as that skill-based learning thing. I think that it's a good example because it's very practical, it's very results oriented. It's very much about changing habits of activity. There's this physical component to it. I'd argue that it's a skill set much more than it is a knowledge exercise. To strengthen that point, when I'm teaching people about the attention compass, I'll make a point about how things work. And clients will usually say, well, that's not terribly surprising. And I typically agree with that statement. The knowledge is not really the key component, nor is it unique. The key component in doing attention compass is doing the skills. It's actually doing and having the habits that I've developed for being more productive, for managing our tasks and attention better. And that's what the attention compass is all about. I will say, if you're frustrated over your ability around being able to do good attention and task management, it's a great tool. With attention compass, I use the phrase work athleticism. And what I mean by that is when we learn the attention compass, we learn ways to put our attention where it needs to be, when it needs to be there. And we learn to keep it there so that we can produce knowledge work in the world. That is, we do something with the information that we receive and we make it valuable to other people. I'll say when we don't know how to do these things, it's not because we're fundamentally broken. It's not because we're stupid. It's probably because we just have some technique problems and need to learn new techniques. And that's really where skills-based training differs from knowledge-based training. It's in the techniques and the practical outcomes of those techniques. I think if you learn attention compass, you'll learn skills that have demonstrated that they help with the challenges and frustrations of modern work environments. And so that may be what you want to do in a minute. It will certainly be our example. So if you want to do that, let me know. I'm not hard to find. Reach out to me via email, larry@dobusywrite.com, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find there. So just send me a note on LinkedIn and tell me that you listen to the podcast and we'll connect there. So what about this template for learning how to do it? So again, the template comes from learning the base. It comes from using those techniques, sharpening those techniques to learn to podcast. And we'll apply all that to implementing attention compass as a goal. And then we can template these steps and make them more realistic. We'll talk about how would we approach a new skills-based learning challenge? What would we do in order to be effective about learning this? And I'll say there are a handful of things that we want to consider as we're engaging in a new skills-based learning project. The first thing is to figure out how to quit exploring whether or not to do it. I think we get stuck in the thought, I'll do it if it turns out that I'm good at it. And by good at it, we mean, well, if it's not too costly and if it's not too much time. Now, I will say we've got to factor in the resources required to learn something. It only makes sense to plan and to think about it carefully. And I do think we want to find an efficient way to get to our goal. But if we're always saying, well, I'll engage with it. If my initial experiments are okay, I'll do it. And I think that takes us to a really bad place because in that sense, we're never committed to doing the things that it takes. We're never committed to changing our techniques. And I refer to that as dabbling in it. So the first thing is to quit exploring whether or not to do it. Decide to do it for a period of time or to the limit of some resource. Say, I'll spend $500 on this, and if I haven't learned it by then, I'll stop and do something else. As long as we're saying, well, I'm not sure I'm actually being a student, I don't want to admit that I'm learning the system, then we're not committed. And that really does weird things to our motivation and to our adoption of tactics. So that's the first thing. Figure out a way to commit to being a learner and put limits around that. I think that's a great idea, but commit to it and get started. The second thing is to have a naive approach to learning something new. You may have heard the phrase, the beginner's mind. And this is what they mean. We tend to be a little bit misguided because we have good results in one area and we try to equate that to good results in another area. And while there's a correlation there, it's not really a strong correlation. Now, if you know how to play the guitar and you want to learn how to play the bass, that's certainly one thing. Those two skill sets overlap a lot. But we're not usually in that position. So, when you've committed to learning something, say to yourself, I really don't know much about a system for being productive. I'm open to learning it, and that'll help you. Another issue with not having a naive approach, if we don't have a naive approach, then we tend to ignore the task of rebuilding habits. Now, we've got habits around almost everything that we do, and we've got to get rid of the old ones before we can have the new ones. We've got to modify these chains of neurons that fire. And if we're naive, then we're open to listening to ideas about technique. If we're not naive, then we try to bring in our old habits with us. Oh, I already know how to do that is an almost perfect defense for learning how to do it. And we understand this. I understood it best in the bass world. I didn't know how to hold a bass. I had seen people do it. I didn't have a whole lot of ego invested in it. So my teacher said, hold the bass this way. Okie doke. He said, one thing he said was, wear a strap even if you're sitting down, because you always want the bass in kind of the same position, whether you're standing or seated. Well, okay, I'll do it. So I was very open to listening to these ideas about technique, and that's important in acquiring any skill. When we turn to productivity, you might have to let go of some established habits, even some that you thought were pretty good, even some that you thought were good ideas. But I'll say this about technique. You've got to be really good at a skill in order to understand the nuances of technique. In the productivity world, I see people do this all the time. People jump from technique to technique to technique, from tool to tool to tool. The problem is if you do that and you never achieve a result, then you really don't know if the tool was bad or if you were just using it improperly. Back to learning the bass. If my arms, hands, fingers hurt when I'm playing the bass, then I need to recognize that I'm doing something wrong and go ask questions about what that technique is. It's probably a technique issue. I don't need to say, well, my body's just broken and I can't do that thing in those ways. Because if I do that, that's an almost perfect defense against learning. So I'll say we need to pick a set of techniques, and this is back to commitment. pick a set of techniques and adhere to that set long enough that you remove the fear that you might just not be good at the technique. So make sure you learn the technique and apply it before you discard it. And that's another good thing about this naive approach. You go in and you go, well, my technique needs rebuilding. Great, we can do that. So number one is to figure out how to quit exploring whether or not to do it. Just commit to do it. Number two is to have a naive approach and say to yourself, I don't know how to do this. There's no reason for me to expect myself to know how to do it. The third is go ahead and be prepared to be bad at it. Whatever skill-based thing you're learning, prepare to get poor results at first. Now, there's lots of reasons why we're bad as beginners. It really doesn't matter. We are. That's the definition of a beginner in a skill, is you're not very good at it. The phrase I use is the first time you do something, you're supposed to be bad at it. If you're able to adopt this mindset, then you'll be better able to learn. Now, I do think we have this self-image, this ego thing that says, hey, I'm good over there, so I'll be good over there. And what evidence do we have that that's true? I mean, yes, you've got to have some idea that you could be good at this new skill that you're trying to pick up, but be prepared to be bad in the early going and recognize that being bad for a while is okay. It's perfectly natural. And if you have that mindset, it really helps. It helps us get rid of our old habits. We say, I'm going to be bad at this the first time, and then we're able to look at why. And it's because of these old habits that we're hanging on to. The other thing about being prepared to be bad is we're more willing to be experimental about it and to persevere in our efforts to learn and get better as we're going through the learning. It helps us motivate ourselves properly. I read a great book on this subject. The book's called The Gap and the Gain. And it describes what happens to us in learning. If we have this high expectation and we look at that expectation and we look at where we are, we're liable to say, wow, I'll never make it that far. I'll never be that good. And at this point, we need to realize, one, that our expectation is probably misguided. You can be good and effective, but the greatest of all time, if you're comparing yourself to the greatest of all time, that's something different. But that's the gap. The gap is between where we are and whatever our expectation might be, and our expectation is probably too high. On the other hand, the gain is the difference between where we are and where we used to be. And if we continue to look at the gain more often than we look at the gap, then that helps us with our motivation. I distinctly remember with the bass thinking, well, I'm not all that good. This was in the year and a half. I said, well, I'm not all that good, but I'm better than I was 6 months ago. And that helped me. It helped me realize that I'm making progress. So think about the gap and the gain as you're learning a new skill. Spend a fair amount of time thinking about what you can do now that you couldn't do before. Number 4, figure out how to get feedback. If you're learning a new skill, figure out how to get feedback. I'll say it has to be from outside of yourself, because you're not a very unbiased judge. You can't hear what you can't hear. Feedback tells you where you are. If we think about the gap and the gain, there's a starting place, there's an expectation, which granted may be overly lofty, but then knowing where we are there is very important. And getting feedback tells us where we are. And then we go and get feedback at a later point, and we can see that we now can do things that we couldn't do before. And that helps with our motivation. The last one, number 5, is in a skills-based learning project, get a coach. Getting a coach is simply about efficiency. It's about not having to scrounge around and invent a process to learn. Your coach will have a process. There is a process, and people have figured this out. They've seen successful processes. And we can argue over, well, is this the best process or is there another better process? Different coaches argue about that sort of thing. I would say don't worry about it. Get a coach, somebody who's gone through it, who has trained other people to do it. It does not have to be true that their trainees are world superstars. It just means that they have to have experience. The coach has to have experience because then they've experienced the roadblocks. They've experienced ways to get people through them, and they have a clear path in mind. If we're do-it-yourselfing here on our learning, then we don't have a clear path. We don't know, for example, that learning B will be easier if you can already do A. And that may or may not be true. It may or may not be obvious, but a coach knows these things. Another thing about a coach, with a coach, you're making a commitment to learning. Mentally, you're making an investment in your learning, and that helps us be motivated. A coach will give you some accountability. Accountability is important. If your coach is not holding you accountable, fire them. Don't just loaf through and make it easy on yourself. Learn. And accountability is very important in that process. Accountability is funny. It does not make us do things we don't want to do, but it does help us do what we know we want to do. With a coach, certainly feedback, technique are there. Another thing, if you go to a bass coach and your bass coach does not start with, here's how you hold a bass, then go and find another coach. It's not much about personality and who we're buddies. It's about who's going to be the best at getting me where I want to be in a reasonable time period. And about that reasonable time period, you don't have to rush your learning usually. The problem is if it drags too much, it saps our motivation. If you get stuck somewhere for 6 months, then your brain's going to jump in and say, well, you never were any good at this anyway, so you ought to just put it down and spend your time doing something else. And it's really easy to fall prey to that. I've done it several times in my life. As an example, the attention compass training is 8 one-hour meetings, 8 weeks. And you'll see lots of progress very quickly, and that'll keep you motivated to get this nailed down. So those are the ideas. That's this template for learning. Again, attention compass was our example. I'd love to talk to you if you're interested in implementing that in your life. If you have something to say about the podcast or some thoughts for me, whatever, love to hear from you. Hit me on email, hit me on LinkedIn. So we'll take a minute to do a recap. What have we talked about today? We've looked at learning and we realized that we're probably not all that great at learning, and this for reasons that I've outlined. We spent some time developing a different perspective on what learning is, and we decided that it's changing the way our brains operate. And then if we know that, then we know better how to do that. For example, repetition is very important in learning a skill. We took a few cases from my own experience and brought out some ideas about learning, about how to motivate it, what to do while we're doing it, some shortcuts that are probably pretty good ideas. And then we thought about that as a template, developing skill around the attention compass implementation. And that's the system that I have and would offer to you. So I'll just highlight the 5 takeaways from our template. The first is quit exploring whether or not you want to do it. Decide to do it. Decide to become a learner. Second is to take a naive approach to this new skill. Look at it from the beginner's mind, and that'll make it easier. The simplest way to get to where you want to be is just be prepared to be bad at it the first time. Be prepared to be a beginner. Both have the beginner's mind and be prepared to get the results of a beginner. Expect to be bad at it when you first start. 4 is figure out how to get feedback. Feedback helps. It's usually not as hurtful as we think it might be. Feedback helps. It tells us where we are, and then we can evaluate progress. And then finally, and this may package it all together, if you just go get a coach rather than trying to figure it out for yourself, then I think that'll be the most efficient way to do this. Well, I hope that you're motivated to take on a new skill-based learning project. Good luck with that. I hope this is helpful as you do that. And if you can't think of a skill-based project, I've got one for you. So I'd be happy to talk about that. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.